Welcome back to another installment of Space This Week, the Monday show where we discuss all the latest and greatest news relating to spaceflight and space launch events. Lots of success from launch sites around the globe last week, so no point dilly-dallying in the intro for too long. I do like to start these videos though by briefly asking you to make sure you're subscribed so that you get these videos when they come out, so all the stuff I'm about to go through is fresh, up to date, and correct. But I think that's enough chit-chat. Let's transition to our first segment now, all the best spaceflight events that took place last week. Last week, we saw two launches take place on Thursday, the 11th of March. The first is currently on screen and was another SpaceX Starlink mission. This was the 21st Starlink mission and was once again conducted with a Falcon 9 rocket. The Falcon 9 launched from the Kennedy Space Center, carrying 60 Starlink satellites, which were successfully deployed into low Earth orbit not long after launch. This was the 6th flight of this particular Falcon 9 first stage, and I've no doubt that it won't be its last, as it successfully touched down 633 kilometers downrange on the Just Read the Instructions drone ship. SpaceX also managed to recover the two fairing halves from the water, with recovery vessels Go Searcher and Go Navigator, and the fairings for this mission are of particular note, as this mission boasts the record of first and second fastest turnaround for fairing half reuse. These two fairing pieces were last used by SpaceX 88 and 110 days ago for each half respectively, beating SpaceX's previous record of 127 days between flights. Excellent stuff. This latest addition to the Starlink mega constellation is a great addition to SpaceX's mission of providing high-speed satellite internet on a near global scale. The second launch of the week was on Thursday and was in China and was a Long March 7A, which launched from the Wenchang Launch Center with a Xi'an 9 technology demonstration satellite on board, which will test new technologies such as space environmental monitoring, according to the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation. The satellite is now operational in geosynchronous Earth orbit, which is good news, as this marks the first ever successful flight of the Long March 7A. Its maiden flight in March 2020 ended in failure, though it hasn't really been publicly disclosed exactly what the failure was. Whatever it was, I'm glad to see that it appears to have been remedied. The next flight was on Friday the 12th of March and was a suborbital flight from India. Since the Indian government is notorious for copyright claiming all footage of their launches, we once again have this cute cat video to serve as replacement video coverage for this one. The flight was performed by a Rohini RH-300 Mark III sounding rocket, which launched from the Satish Dhawan Space Center. The Rohini rocket family is primarily designed for meteorological and atmospheric study, and the objective of this particular flight was to study attitudinal variations in the neutral winds and plasma dynamics. While a shame I can't show it to you, I'm glad this flight was a success. The next flight was on Saturday the 13th of March, and we're back to orbital launches again. This was a Chinese Long March 4C, which launched 3 Yaogan 31 reconnaissance satellites from the Huiquan Satellite Launch Center, which are all now operational in low Earth orbit. On March the 14th, we saw another SpaceX Starlink mission. This is fairly similar to the last. 60 more Starlink satellites were launched from the Kennedy Space Center by a Falcon 9 rocket, but this mission does have some noteworthy points to mention. Firstly, this was the first time a Falcon 9 first stage has flown for the 9th time, and with another successful landing on the drone ship Of Course I Still Love You, it may not be very long before we see SpaceX reach double digits for booster reflights. The fairings also broke the record set by the previous Starlink mission of the week. The fairings for this mission previously flew on SpaceX's Transporter 1 mission, meaning that the turnaround for the fairing reuse was just 49 days for both halves, beating the previous record of 88 days. That was the last launch of the week, but it's not the final bit of news I wanted to discuss. Down at Boca Chica, Texas, SpaceX are storming ahead with their Starship development. The biggest thing to happen last week was the rollout of Starship prototype serial number 11 down to the launch pad, and the increasing rate at which SpaceX are launching these things makes me very excited about the next few days, as it really might not be very long at all before we see it fly. It's already passed its cryo testing, so it just needs to undergo static fire testing before before it'll be ready to fly. It probably won't be this week, but I'm certain we'll see it fly before the end of the month at the very latest. Interestingly, Austin Barnard snapped these pictures of what looks like SpaceX engineers testing the lowering of the landing legs, since the landing legs failed to deploy correctly on the flight of SN10, which contributed quite heavily to the prototype's rather explosive demise. It is crazy to see the size of these things compared to people. It's often hard to appreciate how massive these Starship vehicles are, since there is rarely a good sense of scale in photos. The legs always look tiny on video, but seeing them next to people is a really good indicator of just how beefy they actually are. Brendan Lewis has once again supplied us with an excellent overview of the status of the other Starship and Super Heavy prototypes. We can see that the SN15 is looking very close to completion, which is very exciting as it purportedly will have the biggest upgrades over the SN8 that we've seen yet. SN9 to 11 have only had fairly minor improvements by comparison. We can also see that the Super Heavy booster is rapidly approaching completion, with stacking in the high bay coming along very nicely. Overall, exciting times are right around the corner with Starship. That's it for launch and Starship news for last week, but before we move on to this week, you guys know I gotta shamelessly ask for a like down below if you're enjoying the video so far. It helps us to survive the algorithms and all that, but now that's done, let's move along to our next segment, all the launches happening this week. The first launch of the week will be on Saturday, March the 20th, and this will be a Soyuz 2.1A, which will launch from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. On board will be numerous satellites of numerous purpose from numerous countries. In total, there are 40 satellites in the payload fairing, with clients from South Korea, Japan, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, Germany, Russia, Slovakia, the Netherlands, Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, Brazil, Italy, Kenya, Spain, Thailand, Argentina, Hungary, and finally, there's one satellite from Tunisia called Challenge 1. It's a satellite for the Internet of Things, and it's the first ever Tunisian satellite. Here's hoping the launch goes well, though I'm sure it will, as the Soyuz is one of the most reliable rockets out there. There's only one other launch planned for this week, and it's on the 21st of March. This will be another SpaceX Starlink mission, which will follow a very similar flight plan of the previous Starlink missions that I talked about in our last week segment, so not much need for me to repeat myself with in-depth descriptions of this flight, but expect to see a Falcon 9 launch, have its first stage land, and see 60 more Starlink satellites deploy. Anyway, now that's all out of the way, let's roll along to our final segment for the video, all the most interesting spaceflight anniversaries set to take place over the next 7 days. Ladies and gentlemen, our first anniversary is a major one for the history of spaceflight. On the 16th of March in 1926, Robert Goddard launched the world's first ever liquid-fueled rocket from Auburn, Massachusetts. And here he is, next to it. Now, it's kind of a weird design, right? It's hard to tell where the rocket even is here. It just looks like a bunch of wires and pipes. And that's because, unlike all modern rockets, the engines are at the top and the fuel tanks are at the bottom, due to Goddard's belief that the rocket would achieve stability by hanging from the engine like a pendulum in flight. However, the rocket veered off course shortly after launch and crashed 56 meters away, indicating that the rocket was no more stable than one with the engines at the base, which is far easier to build due to the simplified plumbing involved, and of course nothing needs to go underneath the flames of the engine. This misbelief of Goddard's, and I'm sure this misbelief of many new Kerbal Space Program players too, is known as the pendulum rocket fallacy. The fuel tank won't hang below the engine like a pendulum because gravitation is universal. Gravity will affect the whole ship equally, regardless of where the engines are. So it just makes a lot more sense to put the engines at the bottom, which is a lesson that Goddard learned fairly quickly, as his later rockets were far more similar in design to what we're used to seeing today. The same day as Goddard's historic flight, but 40 years later, in 1966, Gemini 8 was launched. This was America's 12th manned spaceflight and was the first space docking with an Agena target vehicle. The mission started off smoothly, and Gemini 8 successfully docked with the Agena target vehicle. All seemed fine. The Agena then began executing its stored program, which was to turn the combined docked spacecraft 90 degrees to the right. It was at this point, however, that pilot David R. Scott noticed that they were rolling. Command pilot Neil Armstrong countered the spin by firing the Gemini spacecraft's maneuvering thrusters, but after it stopped, it immediately started again. During this time, the Gemini's thruster fuel had dropped to just 30%. Such a rapid depletion indicated that the roll could be due to a defect on the Gemini, rather than on the Agena. The crew decided to undock from the Agena, and once separated, the rotation speed of the roll began to increase now that the craft had shed the mass of the Agena. Clearly, the issue was on the Gemini. Armstrong quickly shut down the maneuvering thrusters and stopped the spin with the re-entry control thrusters instead, mercifully bringing the spacecraft to a halt. After testing each of the maneuvering thrusters individually, it was found that number 8 was stuck on, and was therefore the culprit of the roll. Armstrong used nearly 75% of the re-entry maneuvering fuel to stop the tumble, and mission rules stated that any use of the re-entry control system for any reason mandated an immediate mission abort, and so the spacecraft prepared for an emergency landing, which took place 1 orbit later, with splashdown occurring just off the coast of Japan 3 days earlier than planned. On the 17th of March in 1958, the United States launched Vanguard 1. This was the 4th satellite ever launched, following Sputnik 1 and 2 and Explorer 1, but what was special about Vanguard 1 was that it was the first satellite to be solar-powered, and was the first satellite to achieve a long-term orbit. How long is long-term, I hear you ask? Well, as of today, the spacecraft and the upper stage of its launch vehicle are still in Earth orbit, although communications with the satellite were lost in 1964. Still, this makes it the oldest human-made object still in orbit, and that won't change anytime soon. Orbital decay isn't expected until 2198, meaning that the total orbital lifetime of the probe will be about 240 years. On the 18th of March in 1965, Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov left his spacecraft, Voskhod 2, for 12 minutes, and in doing so became the first person to walk in space. Spacewalks these days are fairly commonplace, but back then this was a gargantuan achievement for the Soviet space program. Leonov exited the Voskhod spacecraft via an inflatable airlock, something that may look familiar to any KSP players watching. After his legendary spacewalk, Leonov was selected to be the first Soviet person to land on the moon, though of course the project was cancelled before this could happen. He did, however, command the Soyuz capsule in the historic Soyuz Apollo mission, which docked in space for 2 days with an American Apollo capsule. On March the 21st in 1965, NASA launched Ranger 9, which was the last in a series of unmanned lunar space probes. The Ranger 9 carried no scientific experiments, but was instead fitted with 6 television cameras, which broadcasted images live to millions of viewers across the United States. The Ranger 9 impacted the moon, as planned, 2 days, 16 hours, and 31 minutes after launch, transmitting some excellent photos back home in the process. The Ranger 9 was the last of the Ranger space probes, and fittingly is also the last anniversary this week. What a week it's been! Lots of great news over at Camp SpaceX, with Starlink success and another Starship all ready to once again go and make history. The times we live in are certainly exciting ones. Here's hoping that the upgrades to the SN11 made based on the data gathered by the SN10 will mean that we get a complete success, without any rapid unplanned disassembly or any sudden unscheduled reflight either, when the SN11 makes its high altitude hop. One thing is for sure though, what's on screen right now? It's an end screen, right? The left-hand side is a link to the full Space This Week playlist. The right is a video chosen for you by YouTube's recommendation algorithm based on your viewing habits. I do hope it's a good one. There's also links to subscribe and check out Patreon, and the description will have links to things like Twitter, Instagram, merchandise, all that good stuff. Guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on Saturday for our next Kerbal adventure.